Hello again, gamers and gamettes, and welcome to yet another episode of Not So Hardcore Gaming. I'm your host, Jeremy, and today I am on my own once again, and I will be talking about Dark Souls 2. Now, I will start by saying the very first of the type of genre is this, Dark Souls, Bloodborne. Bloodborne was the first I ever played. So, I was used to fast-paced combat, always dodging, that sort of thing. And I was interested going into Dark Souls 2 because, it's said it's one of the most difficult games out there, as is Bloodborne. And I was kind of excited because when I was playing Bloodborne, the challenge was exciting to me, and I had very high hopes for this game, and all my hopes were fully fulfilled. It was wonderful, and I will get to tell you why. And going into it, I obviously, as I said, I kept an open mind, but I had heard the combat is slightly slower paced. And, I wasn't as sure because, I was so used to more fast-paced games. But as I started to play it, I found I actually really got into it. Starting it, I was very excited to play it. And right from starting it up, it was pretty much exactly how I expected it to be, in obviously a completely good way. So we'll get into the starting stuff that we do, the different aspects of the game, and we will start with visual and audio, as I always try to do. It's the first thing you see out there. Visually, it's highly detailed. Now, the one I was playing was the Scholar of the First Sin, and I'm not quite sure if that was remastered in any way, so I don't know if it was higher quality than most people would have experienced it when they first played it, but, as of me playing it, the visuals are highly detailed. Obviously not quite as detailed as current games, but a really good amount of detail. The general feeling you get when you look at it, it's ancient. Like crumbling buildings, old stone walls. Everything you can tell has been there for a very, very long time. And I like that look in a lot of games because it gives you a feeling, that it's been explored before. It's always a really good feeling when you look at something and you know that it is a very old land, because it means there will be a lot to find out about it. And this one, there's not so much a story as there is lore, which I will get into later, but it's fun. It's discovering a lot of stuff about it because there has to be a lot of story behind it. So as I said, visually it is one of the most beautiful games I've played. It very much fits the type of game it is, and there's a lot of variation. You've got different seasons in certain ones, like there's a Winterland, which changes everything. I love both the variety and the general theme that it goes with. In terms of audio, there's not as much as there are in a lot of things, because, there's no wildlife to make noise, and in a lot of places it's very, very quiet. And as I said, that again fits with the lore, but even with all that lack of sound, it works in its favor because it sets the scene. It feels good for the atmosphere you want to have when you're playing the game. And, you know, it's, as I said, I always love when they do think a little bit different. Like a lot of games that want to make a lot of background noise, but, you know, they're trying something different and they really make it work. And I love seeing that. So for this, as I said, this is unlike most games I've played in both visual and audio, and it's just done so well. So I really do have to commend them for that. It's wonderful to see and listen, and that's the basics of it. Now the next thing I'll talk about, because again it's similar in terms of visuals, I will mention about some of the bosses. Now, this is obviously one of the things you would want to put the most work on, is designing different bosses, and this game has a lot of them. But when you start to design one, you have to make new sounds for it, you have to do all new textures and really animate the movements of it. There's a lot of work that goes into building and designing a boss right from scratch. And not only because of the amount of bosses it has, but the detail on each one, it's absolutely phenomenal. Right from, and this is, I believe, the first, or one of the first two, depending on how you play it, the last giant, I think he is one of the most perfect bosses you could design as the first boss. He's intimidating because, as his name indicates, he's a giant, and as your combat towards him is difficult, he sets a challenge, a reasonable challenge for the stage you are, and just visually, he is really good to look at. It's a more simple design, and I like the fact that he actually has no face, really, that sets the scene. It's sort of a bit creepy, but as I said, he is the perfect boss you can start with. And, you know, you get to other bosses where I'll talk about a couple in terms of visual, the designs done for them. One example, and this is one I actually, admittedly, I didn't discover until very late on in the game, which is the Executioner's Chariot. Somehow I never went to his area, and going there was, even where I was, it was a bit of a difficult boss fight, because obviously you have to navigate your way around without getting hit by him. And again, visually, as I think it is always important to mention, he's intimidating. He has a lot of detail done to it. You know, the beautiful noises. It's animated very well. And it's really cool to just let it seep in and to watch it. I can't really go into too much detail in describing them, because obviously it's far more difficult to describe something accurately that people can visualize it. But, you know, this is one I think if you look up, you'd be rather impressed with. I was very impressed with it. Now, as I said earlier, the sheer number of bosses in this is impressive, and some of them will look similar to ones you've played, but others look completely unique, and I love the creativity that has to be put in for it. You've got, and I'll actually check it because I don't know the exact number, It says there are 32 bosses. I think that includes the DLCs. And that number alone is impressive. If you go back to, as I will often make small comparisons towards, because it's a similar sort of game and I think it's done by the same studio, Bloodborne has a lot less bosses. It's a bit of a bigger game, and comparing it, it's impressive, especially considering the fact that Dark Souls 2 was a much older game, and the DLCs add to it, but even the base game has a lot more. Like Bloodborne has 11 bosses or so, I think, in the main game. It's impressive just knowing there's 32, and it means there is a hell of a lot to play from, and the more you have to do, the better the game in most cases. Sometimes if you go too far, it can be a bit more grindy and tedious, but I think this is actually a beautiful amount. So yeah, as I said, the bosses, they look good, they sound good, they are large in number. I genuinely can't think of any criticisms towards it, because once I actually got into the game, I absolutely fell in love with it. So there's that. I've talked visual and audio and bosses. Next, I think I'm actually going to go and talk about weapons and armor. Obviously, I'll talk about them slightly separately. There is an array of weapons you can use. You've got ranged and melee, which is good fun. I love being able to choose long-range combat in any game, and this one, they're both difficult to use, but great fun. For the most part, I didn't use the bow as much, but the way it was designed, it was good fun. I ended up going with the Dragon Rider bow, I think, which, by the way, looked beautiful. And that is one thing. The designs of all the weapons, they all look really quite detailed and genuinely, as I said, a lot of work put into them. Sorry, I went off a little bit there. There's different classes of weapons. I love that each changes the pace a little bit. The one I ended up sticking with mostly was the Estoc, I think, which was fast, and I think that made it a little bit easier. That was one of the faster weapons, and it helped me to be a tiny bit more familiar, and that's the one I think I stuck with almost the whole time. And as I said, there's really nothing that I can say that takes away from it. There's a huge array, which means you can change your combat style at any time. Gives you a lot of freedom. And other ones, you can enchant them with certain types of damage, and you can upgrade them to a certain limit. It gives you a reason to go out and go to different areas to get certain resources to upgrade your weapon. It reinforces it. It makes it more fun, and as I said, being able to alter it however you wish gives a lot more freedom in any game, and it gives you reason to play things again. You think, okay, I've completed with this weapon, I want to use a completely different type of combat, and you've got both weapons and you can use magic, and that just adds more. Really, as I said, I always like to appreciate it when you look and you say this aspect expands it, this expands it more, etc., etc. And this is one of the best for it. There is so much you can do just a little bit differently, which has a surprisingly strong effect on how different the gameplay can be. Next, you've got the armor. Now, one thing I did like, which I guess goes a bit both ways. On one hand, it could be a little bit annoying, but on the other hand, it was kind of more fun. If you wear heavier armor, you move a bit slower, and I didn't realize as quick as I think I should have that I needed to raise one of my stats to be able to move quicker with the better armor that I went for. And it made it so much easier and so much faster, and therefore I found slightly more engaging once I went up that little bit. And I think, and this is a case with most, the armor stats didn't do as much for me. They did make a difference, but not quite as much as you would hope. But, as I said, that's just me. When it comes to shields, I always had a shield, but shield combat I sucked at. I've never once been able to parry. That's one of the many things I kind of suck at. But it's, that's just another aspect of it. The difficulty of it is really good. And as there's so much you can do differently, so much which would make the game easier or more difficult, and I love that. Moving on, we'll talk about gameplay itself. Now, as I've mentioned, there is a lot of gameplay aspects you can do differently, and all of it, firstly, in terms of gameplay, the difficulty is great. I never used to be the type where I enjoyed a genuinely difficult game, and believe me, many swear words were said, many, but in the end, it was really engaging, and I enjoyed how difficult it was. And, you always get that great sense of achievement when you finally beat that boss that has killed you 17 times, and you get that rush of adrenaline. It's great. And as the gameplay itself plays into that quite a lot, there's very little room for error, which really, I think that's as simple as it gets, is one error costs you a lot more than it would in most games, and it makes the gameplay so much more difficult but so much more enticing. In terms of how it's designed, the gameplay, it's genuinely impressive. As I said, you've got different weapons deal different types of damage, for example, and different types of damage work better for separate bosses, and it really gives you a reason to do things differently, to change up throughout the game. And every weapon you use is designed beautifully. I love looking at it and going, I'm going to try something new, this different weapon, and it feels like a completely different game. And that is a beautiful thing, that just the slightest change changes your whole experience altogether. And this is one of the best games I've seen for that. As there's extra things like being able to counter-attack your enemy, although I think I'm using the wrong word, but that's one of the bits I could never pick up very well, and I guess that's just a comment to my own personal skill. There's obviously, you can customize some controls differently, turn sensitivity up, whatever else. I tended to stick with it. The gameplay is just designed very, very well. There's not much else I can add that I haven't said already. Also, I know I repeat myself a lot, and I apologize, but I just have a tendency to do that. Moving on, I want to talk briefly about the pace. Now, in terms of gameplay, as I've said earlier, it is a bit of a slower game. The combat it's not half as fast as things like Bloodborne, and I think that works in its favor. Like, it means you're playing it for longer in the end, and I quite like that. And I consider it separate from the two, even though I draw similarities between this and Bloodborne. I, in the end, do consider them to be completely separate, but each have their own thing that they did slightly better. And the pace of it is unique, I guess, kind of. I get a similar sort of vibe from it, and I think it's more due to the fact that there isn't much of a story that plays into the pace, which I'll get to in a sec. It just fits with the whole atmosphere of the game. The, as I said, ancient crumbling walls, the sense of how much history has happened in this land. The pace sort of just fits in like one piece of the puzzle, and it works well. As I just mentioned then, the next thing is the fact that I wouldn't say there is as much a story as there is lore. And I consider those to be different because when you look at a story, it's sort of what happens in the game is, separate. It's compared to the lore. The lore is what has happened around the game or before the game, and the story is what happens during the game. And during the game, there's not much story because, you complete one boss and you go to a different land and you have to find out what happened beforehand because your actions in the game don't affect the rest of the world inside the game. And even as you play along, you don't really get a lot of the history of the land unless you really seek it out, like little notes, similar sort of things. You have to go down and personally hunt down all the elements of the lore to know what's happened. And I'm not usually the type that goes hunting down lore. It's just sort of not for me. I can be a bit of an impatient person, and when you look at a game such as this, there is a lot that you have to find. And, so I'll end up watching a video where it explains a lot of the lore, and that's how I go about it. And, as I said, I think that's an important distinction to be made. But in terms of the lore that's there, it's just another aspect that plays into the atmosphere of the game, and that's one thing I cannot say enough. The atmosphere inside the game is unlike any other game I've played, and every aspect just plays into it a little bit further. That just, it's like a little bit of polish. It just makes that extra little bit brighter, extra little bit shiny. It's beautiful. And it's one thing I never used to like, is not having the story but having hidden, obscured lore. I never used to like that, but as I've gotten further into it, as I've played more games that do this, I've started to get a new appreciation from it, because it's easy enough to write a story, to say, you do this is what happens next. It seems to me it's more difficult to find an engaging story where you say, here's a little piece of the puzzle that you need to put together, go out and find the rest of the pieces, it drums up a lot of love from the game from consumers. And it's more difficult to do because you have to be vague about certain details. You have to I don't know how to explain it, but it's really difficult to do it the way it's done now. And obviously, the amount of games I've played, I haven't played as many as a lot of people, considering my age, but even still, you don't hear about many games that do it this well. Games that really stick out as much as this does. And I cannot commend it enough for everything it does right. Personally, and when it comes to this game, I genuinely have no real criticism about it, because everything, the difficulty of it, which I would usually say, I'm not a fan of, that is just part of it. It's everything that I used to not like, I now do like because of both Bloodborne and this. A lot of it just, to me, I've looked at it and I've thought, that's not too bad. I quite like the way they did that. And it's opened up my mind. So this was not so much a game as it was an experience. And boy, have I enjoyed the experience. I want to do more games like this. The games where every new area is a new challenge. It's something that keeps me playing, keeps me involved. If you have any recommendations, I'm absolutely happy to. I have a Facebook page, Not So Hardcore Gaming. You can comment there at any point. You can send me messages through there. I also have Instagram where you can do the same. If you have any recommendations that you want to give me, I would love to hear what you have to say. I'm looking for more that I can do here, and I want to be able to engage with my listeners. So I would love it if you could check me out there. You could, even if you want to give me an opinion about a game I've talked about, I would love to hear what you have to say. And I'd love to hear recommendations, everything. That would be absolutely very much appreciated. It would be great. And that's about all there is to say. Every aspect of this game, to finish off, I have loved everything. It has shocked me that I can look at it and now say, there's nothing about it that I didn't like. It's because I didn't like it starting, but by the time I finished, I thought, that's actually a pretty good way of doing things. It has done what few other games can do, and I really, really admire that. So, that's all she wrote. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I always appreciate having you here, and I hope to see you in the next episode. So, this is Not So Hardcore Gaming. I'm Jeremy, signing off.